Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
in Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight. Welcome back. It's another episode of the Freight 360 podcast. Before we get started today, please make sure to leave that thumbs up, like the video on YouTube, leave a 5-star review. Send us, share us with your friends in the industry, your colleagues. Check out all of our other content at freight360.net, including the Freight Broker Basics course for a full-length educational option. And yeah, we appreciate you guys listening. We keep seeing our stats go up every single week, and we appreciate it. So, Ben, how we doing? You guys are in hurricane mode. I know it doesn't look like it's going to hit you directly, but what's going on in Florida?
Yeah, all pretty good. I mean, it looks like since we're on the underneath of it or whatever, on the right side of it, depending on how you're looking at it, we're supposed to just get a lot of rain today. It's been raining for the past couple of days, but then it's just like 24 hours of high winds is what it's supposed to be. So sometime either this afternoon or maybe right after work, I got to bring in everything, all the potted plants. I'm going to probably throw up my hurricane shutters anyway, at the very least. I might as well. I think that's about it, to be honest. Pull my car into the garage and just hope none of the trees or anything come down around here. I mean, that is what it is.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess, winter weather season for the Northeast. Comes every year. You hope you don't get the worst of it, but sometimes it sucks. So anyone down in the Tampa area, we're thinking about it. We're recording this on Wednesday, so it's supposed to hit, I think, tonight or tomorrow morning. But yeah, all right. Sports, Bills suck. I'm not even gonna go on. Did the Steelers? Yeah, Steelers lost too, right?
Steelers lost. That's why I was texting you, and almost all three similar in a sense that like they were like basically 2 3-point games.
Yeah.
Steelers. I didn't even watch the end of it. It was on until like 1 a.m. because there was a huge storm delay. I don't think the kickoff was until like 9:30, 9:45. Yeah. Like it was so late.
It was really, really late. Yeah. That was it was in Pittsburgh and it was pouring. I remember seeing the video of like a dude drinking a beer under his poncho or something like that. But yeah. The Cowboys got the win there. But anyway, we're gonna move on from sad, hurting football fans. So, news. Well, it's hurricane season, so I think it's worth noting the impact on our industry from stuff like this. So, we've included it in our newsletter the last week and this week as well. The amount of freight that gets delayed and then the demand for stuff getting shipped in afterward it's very noticeable, right? And it's going to impact those markets. This is something that we talk about every year. It's somewhat predictable. We don't know where it's going to happen, but we always know that there's going to be tropical storms that come through that area of the United States. And we typically know the time of year that it's going to happen, right? September, October. But this is the time of year when if you're dealing with FEMA freight or building materials are huge after a storm in a certain area because they've got to rebuild a lot of stuff. You've got people don't even think about some of the other stuff too, like generators, construction equipment to clear debris. All of that stuff gets moved in by truck. So there is a big demand to get stuff out before a storm impacts, and then a really big demand to get stuff in afterward. So just keep that stuff in mind as you're dealing with your carriers and your customers in the coming weeks here. What else we got going on in news? Or anything else to add on that?
Not really. Strike was over. I mean, not much.
Oh yeah, we spent quite a bit of time on our recent podcast episodes talking about the strikes, and by the time those episodes released, the strike was over. But it's worth noting, right? That's the kind of it's kind of like a hurricane, right? We talk about a hurricane, and the hurricane already passes by the time our episode's out. This is the kind of stuff that is you can have a general learning lesson from it, right? So strikes, we had the Canadian rail strikes earlier in the year, the East Coast and Gulf port strikes that only lasted 3 days. But this is the kind of stuff that if you're not paying attention to it, it happens. You're going to be sitting there scratching your head and wondering what's going on and why you didn't prepare for it. So yeah, it's all, valuable information one way or another. So yeah, so let's get into today's episode, man. We had I couldn't find the exact email, but we had a guy that said, if you guys could go back and do it all over again, what would you do differently? And I thought it'd be a really good discussion to have on a podcast, because a lot of you guys are new, and we hope that you can learn from the things that we did right, the things that we could have done differently, things that we utterly failed at in our journey. Because if you can learn from someone else's mistake and not make the same mistake yourself, it's not really a bad thing. It's always a good thing.
Here.
So yeah, we'll kind of keep a general discussion there. So, is there anything that the top of mind that sticks out to you that you would do differently?
It's funny. I was just thinking about this and I'm like, okay, because I like the way you even framed that. Like, what are the things that like were big mistakes or things that, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, yeah, that one like hurt a little bit. The one story, and I use this story all of the time, still to this day. And this wasn't specifically me, but it was something I learned in the same instance. Like, my manager or mentor taught me this, right? And it was a lesson that somebody else had to learn the hard way. And it just always resonated with me. And this was, it was a broker that was there like a year or two before me, like somewhat recently. And he was trying to get to the point across of like efficiency or effectiveness. So to kind of set the context, like I was at a big box brokerage, right? And commissions are 25% and it's cradle to the grave. And that's important because like what you have to do in a given day is relevant to what you can get done, right? Like how many things are on your plate. So in this scenario, right, like cradle to the grave. So like we got to prospect customers, you got to cover your own freight, you got to check call your own drivers, you got to make sure your customers are paying the bills. Like you're responsible, very similar to what it is like for an agency, right? Except you've got resources behind you, you got branding a bit, and you've got lots of carriers that already work with the organization. So you do have somewhat of an advantage, and you're getting about 25% commission. So also, which is important, is like, what are the benchmarks, at least at the company I was at? And these are pretty similar, was like, okay, like you need to do $4,000 a week in gross profit, not revenue, not like total sales, like in margin, because that's the line that you need to basically hit before you earn commission, because it's basically like staggered salary. So like you make $4,000 a month. So, okay, $4,000 divided by 4 is $1,000 a week. Okay. Well, you need $4,000 in commission because at 25% of $4,000 is $1,000. So as soon as you cover your salary is when you start to qualify basically for your commission. It doesn't get stacked on your salary. You've got to basically pay your salary back and then you earn commission, right?
Okay.
So if you can't make $4,000 a week in gross profit, like you just never get out of your base salary, which is roughly $4,000 a month, we'll say, right? And, the question was posed like, okay, like, well, why did you take the job? Like, almost all of us took the job because we wanted to make six figures, like at a minimum, right? Like you don't want to work this hard because we're working for sure at that time. Like I was working 50, 60 hours a week at minimum, even just prospecting to try to get over this hump as quick as possible. Because again, and also where I live, like $4,000 a month cost of living does not get you very far. Like you basically would need roommates, or like you can't have a car payment. Like there's just not enough money to be able to actually live where I do on that number, right? So it's a race to get over it. And the question or the context is like, well, okay, if you've got to make $4,000 a week in GP, right? The other thing is like the average like successful broker, just one person with no assistants, like you're going to be able to move maybe 30, 35 loads a week at max. Like for me, at about 27 or 28, like I kind of couldn't keep track of it in my head. And again, you still have a TMS, but like you still are thinking about these things when you're moving that much freight because your customer's talking to you all day. You kind of need to know where your guys are in any given day to be able to give updates. And that's kind of like the bandwidth. Like you just really can't do much more. Now there are other, for sure examples where like you could run drayage at much higher volumes, but there's much lower margins. So you got to do more loads to get to the same number. And the person that he was explaining, it was a guy that was successful. And he had said, this guy had been there for about a year and a half. And he was doing about that, like 28, 29 loads a week. but he just couldn't get over the 4 grand mark, like 3,900, 3,500, somewhere around there, and was doing this for like the better part of a year. Now, the interesting thing is, like, from a manager's point of view, like, they're also supposed to have the company's best interest in mind. So, from a company's perspective, like, that's fantastic. That guy's basically just moving freight and paying for himself. I mean, like, it's
Just
not that
making them
bad.
some money. Yeah.
Correct. And at the end of the day, like, okay, but like, they want people to be able to succeed. Otherwise, like, you're not going to stay there indefinitely either. And the conversation he had with this broker at the time was like, listen, what do you think the issue was? And, the guy's like, I just kind of need to be able to move more loads, just like get one more prospect to be able to get over that. But the thing he wasn't really keeping in his mind, the broker was like, well, how many hours a day are you working right now? And this guy's working like 11 hours a day, right? And he's not even earning commission. So, I mean, like, it's almost kind of an example of like he's probably almost even making minimum wage at that point when you factor in how many hours he's working, how hard he's working, and just really not benefiting from any of this. And, the punchline at the end of the story was like, it wasn't that he just needed another customer. What he actually needed to do was start over. And this was the hard conversation my manager said he had with him was like, listen, if you really want to make, the money you say you do, which is 100 grand a year, we'll say, like, you don't have the right customers.
Basically, go
And
back to the drawing board on your
yes.
book, right?
And that's super hard, mostly because like emotionally they call it a sunk cost
Yeah.
bias, but all of us have it. Like the more time you put into something, even if it's losing, it's emotionally very difficult to give up on.
Have you fallen victim to double brokering, cargo theft, or identity theft? Quickscope stands out as the only load level fraud protection tool available today. Unlike any other solution on the market, Quickscope is deployed post-agreement between shippers or brokers and carriers. Shippers can rest assured that their cargo remains secure. Brokers can confidently confirm the identity of the individuals on site for pickup, and carriers can trust that they'll receive timely payment. Start your free trial with Quickscope today by visiting them online at quickscope.com. That's QUIKSKOPE.com. Blue Book Services is the resource you need if you're transporting fresh produce or lumber. Their online databases contain thousands of companies throughout the produce and lumber industry supply chains. You can easily search their databases to generate new sales leads. Blue Book's credit ratings help you avoid companies with high credit risk, and their team can help resolve disputed loads. To learn more, go to producebluebook.com or lumberbluebook.com and click Join today.
Because like you spent so many days and weeks and months building this thing that you realize like just isn't working. And human beings have a very hard time letting go of those things to do more of the things they need to. And ultimately, that's what this guy did and then was successful. Like he literally stopped working with all of his customers because they weren't the right type of customers for that freight brokerage. A brokerage that you need to charge higher margins for the broker to actually take home some money, right? After you cover all the costs, like you need freight that needs high service. And in this case, the guy was basically moving lumber loads that were like jump ball freight, $150 per load at the time. And again, this is many years ago, but like you just can't cover that many loads in a given day to be able to add enough of those together to ever actually earn an income. And that was one of those lessons that just kind of always stuck with me is that like not all customers and not all freight is created equal. And you can't just add more of a bad thing to get a good result. Like sometimes you really got to look at who and what you're working with to determine like, are these the right customers? And in other scenarios, like that might be pay terms with the customer. But for sure, margin plays into it because like, again, as brokers, like we provide a value to shippers. And I don't think people think about this much. They just think, especially I think a lot of trucking companies think just because we have a brokerage license, we just add margin to things and shippers are just somehow willing to pay it. And then we just give a load to a truck and just sit back and watch things happen. But the reality is like we have tools and software we have to pay for that allow us to vet carriers, negotiate with them much faster than a shipper can. That's what our advantage is. That's how we help the market is we do the things that it takes a company and a procurement department sometimes weeks to do. Process contracts, vet a carrier, look at insurance, go through all of these check marks. We do that sometimes like 30, 45 seconds, right?
Yeah.
Well, we got to pay for those tools. That's the value we provide back to the shipper. And then the value to the carriers are we help bring these smaller carriers loads they would never be able to get, because a trucking company that's got 2 or 3 drivers and like a couple trailers is not going to be able to provide enough value to work with a very large company, whether it's Walmart or, just as an example, because again, Walmart would have to work with hundreds of thousands of carriers on a daily basis just to be able to move their freight. So brokers are able to pool lots of smaller companies together, get them more freight that they wouldn't be able to get otherwise, and the shipper benefits because we can move faster. But that comes at a cost of time, resources, and labor and tools. There has to be some way to be able to cover that and at least pay for the effort and time you're doing for that service. And it was just one of those lessons. I use that story constantly with clients to just point out that, like, sometimes more of the same thing isn't going to get you where you need to go.
It's interesting. That's a good one right there. So I'll ask you a question here, because this is the direction I was going to go in. As how were you when you were early on? How up to speed were you with like market news and like staying up to date with regulations and like kind of
Great
the big?
question.
Were you in it at all or no?
So the interesting thing was, and this is like 2015 or 16, right? Like I came from banking and like an interest in finance. And I was shocked at how our industry functioned, especially back then. I'm like, this industry operates like I still use it now, like kind of like Wall Street did 100 years ago, where like people are just negotiating back and forth for every transaction. And the market is so opaque, meaning like nobody had visibility into what anybody else was doing. The best we could ever do is like look at our system, especially at a big company. Like you could just look at what our company paid for other loads. You could see DAT, but like we couldn't even see DAT's website. Most of us didn't have logins because big companies want you to just live in their TMS. So like
Yeah.
most brokers in these big companies, like we didn't even know. And I remember coworkers didn't even know that like DAT was a website. We just thought it was something attached to the TMS.
To your TMS, yeah.
And I remember the first conversation I had with some of like, I met with our CTO back then, and I was like, hey, one of the things I would love to be able to do, because once I learned this information was out there, I was in Truckstop DAT and our TMS for every load because it was just a little bit more information to give me a little bit of advantage for every situation, whether it's talking to a customer or covering a load. And I remember advocating that we should have some of that data incorporated into the TMS, which I think they ultimately eventually did, but it wasn't there. There were no podcasts, there was no market updates. You really didn't have any information. And also, brokers are incredibly close to the vest with their information on what they pay, what carriers they use. They didn't even want other brokers in the same company to know which carriers they used, because that's what they worked to develop, the relationships, the pricing with some of them. Because for sure, in a big company, like people would fight over carriers the same way they would fight over prospects. You got a great carrier that has given you a great rate. If I got a bunch of loads, I'm calling your carrier. And now all of a sudden you're going to start arguing with me and go, dude, I got 6 more loads to cover. You just booked all my trucks. I need them for my customer. So there were legit disputes over capacity and these things. So like there were legitimate reasons people didn't share this either. And it wasn't available anywhere. And I remember even back then thinking, I'm like, this is a great opportunity for some company to do the CNBC, if you will, of freight, because nobody was doing it at the time.
So FreightWaves, 2016 is when they started.
Yeah,
That
like
sound
right
right?
around then.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell off the top of my head. I mean, I
So
didn't know about them back then for sure.
yeah. So the reason I asked you that question is like when I started in trucking in like I think 2011 or 12, and then brokerage a couple years later. But I like legitimately couldn't put all the pieces together. Like when I was on the trucking side, like I heard heard the phrase 3PL, but I didn't like ever really understand what
Yeah.
3PLs were and what brokerages were. Um, and I think the same goes if someone starts in brokerage and doesn't put the effort in to learn the what does a shipper do? What does a trucking company do? And how do they operate? If you don't take time to truly put yourself in their shoes and understand how they operate, what's important to them, I don't think you can do a great job as a broker in the middle to connect those two parties. So what I would say is that what I would do differently is I would have, because I eventually did get like make it a very big uh, um, important effort of mine to educate myself on the industry, like to a very serious extent, but also to understand macro level events. Like, what did the economy mean for the freight market? What did interest rates mean for the freight market? What does like we said earlier, what does a hurricane mean for the freight market? What does government regulation mean for the freight market? What is the freight market cycle? How does it work? Um, because there was years when I look at my team going back like 10 years and there was like years that we killed it and it felt like it was super easy. And then the next year, like it sucked and we tried
Yep.
really hard. And it's like, nobody understood it was the freight market. Like it had nothing to do with effort. It was just like sometimes, when you have like ELDs, for example, right? ELDs led to, a capacity crunch. And then you have COVID, basically the same thing, right? You have a ton of demand for shipping and you can't just bring trucks into the market overnight by snapping your fingers. Um, but at least by the time COVID came around, I think I understood the freight market a lot better and continue to learn. But going back, I would say if you're new and you want to do something that likely you and I probably didn't do, would be to stay super up to speed, up to date on the news and what's going on, what's impacting our industry overall. Basically, don't just have your short term glasses on, right? Short term vision
Yes.
glasses. You want to have that mid and long range to know what's 3-5 years out from now. What's a year out from now, even.
Or even 4 or 6 months, like
Yeah,
into the next season.
and I think it was 2016 when Freight Waves came out, and I was a couple years into the 3PL world at that point. But there was other stuff, that I was, other sources of getting news. Like I remember setting up Google Alerts to get news about the freight brokerage and logistics industry, and that was like my first way of getting like news every day or every week was to do Google Alerts. And then Freight Waves made it super easy. They're like, hey, we have basically a news website and a show, and all these podcasts started coming out, and like literally they give you more news than you could possibly
Can consume.
consume now
Yes.
in a day. And then you start there's transport topics and, all kinds of other media outlets out there, various newsletters. But yeah, I think my biggest thing that I would say that I would do differently is like educate yourself, like extremely educate yourself from day one, and have a mentality that you're never gonna. There's always something more you need to learn, whether it's an
Yes.
existing topic that you just haven't learned yet, or it's something new that's going to happen that you'll have to learn and understand and comprehend, like a market cycle or something like that, because those things impact, how your customers operate. They impact how carriers think and operate. Like I think back to like 20, like, and again, by COVID I understood market cycles, but I remember 2020 talking to it was 2021, early 21, talking to one of the brokers in our company, and he's like, man, I can't wait till this market shifts, because these carriers have been screwing me the last couple of years on rates. I can't wait till they get screwed. And I was like, probably wouldn't think that way, because, it's going to also impact your paycheck, because if rates go down, we're a margin based business here, so be careful what you wish for. And 2 years straight of down market, he's not so happy anymore. So
It's
uh,
funny, right?
yeah,
To those 2 points, like one, I learned most of that just doing it, right? And through pain, right? Like that's how I feel like everything's learned, right? A little kid learns not to touch something hot because they touch something hot, not because their parents told them not to, right? Like
yeah,
most of what we learn is through experience and making mistakes. That's why they're so valuable. And like the one too that like you were talking ELDs, that was one of the biggest regulatory things that I saw and how much of an impact it had, because at the time, and also to your news point, the reason I went after Maersk as a customer back then was because like they were having large issues in that side of the industry. The ships were super expensive. There was reorganization. And I'm like, well, if they're all shifting around, now might be a good opportunity to be able to have a conversation because so many things are up in the air. This might be a window. Like I kind of looked for change. It took me like 14 months to actually get that deal done. But at the end of it, and the important piece was it was right in the fall heading into the ELDs, which happened in like December. So we just get onboarded with them. And I'll never forget, like, I got phone calls because I was flying to Pittsburgh that year to see family. And I was getting phone calls from India's dispatch team at Maersk going, like, hey, you're now on our approved list. And they were like, I've got a list of like 200 containers. Can you help with them? And I'm like, excuse me, like I never spoke to these people, like we just got approved, I hadn't even moved a load yet. I'm like, well, what do you mean? They're like, we're desperate, we can't get these moved quick enough. And I'll never forget this. I was remember where I was sitting, he's like, open checkbook, all of them, don't care what it costs, if you can get these moved, just send over the rate and we've got blank checks to approve all of it. And I remember, like, it was literally like Christmas, figuratively and literally. And I'm like, oh, this is like the craziest thing ever.
In freight, time is money, and efficiency is key. That's where Levity comes in. Imagine automating your email operations to do more with less effort. Levity connects directly to your inboxes, extracting vital information from emails and attachments in real time. It seamlessly integrates with your TMS, empowering you to quote faster, build loads more efficiently, and book more freight in less time. Whether it's incoming emails from shippers or carriers, Levity's got you covered. It understands any language, any format, and even interprets non-standard formatting. Visit levity.ai today to sign up and get started.
Tired of struggling to find accurate rates and the right carriers for your freight? With DAT1, you can access more than 500 million posted loads and trucks every year. That's 3 times more capacity than any other load board. Plus, their integrated freight management system makes it easy to cover loads 24/7. They have the most trusted network of carriers, brokers, and shippers in the country. You'll get real-time rates on every lane so you know exactly how much a shipment will cost before you commit to it. Plus, you get instant access to top bids from qualified carriers around the country. Get 10% off your first year of DAT1 when you visit the link in the show notes. But the important lesson, right, wasn't this that like a regulation can impact the industry that much in pricing and things, which is important. But the other one was, this was like 4 or 5 months, because it lasted until like May, maybe even June of that year, working through the backlog of containers because of the ELDs, right? And this is like literally spreadsheets with just POs on them. Just, if you can get any of these moved, send over the rate and we'll approve it. So, I mean, like, it was like an entire season of moving as many loads as you can as quickly as you could with resources. Like, we were able to work with carriers to give them rates that were helpful enough that they could move an extra container here or there, working through schedules to figure out how you get one more load moved with each driver every day to be able to just increase the throughput. Learned a ton. But the one lesson I think that impacted me the most was that I'll never forget this. Like, Bruce was on this show many, many years ago. It was a guy I used to work with, right? And
Yeah.
I'll never,
Pommier?
yeah. And
Yeah.
I'll never forget calling him. He was in like the corporate office, and I'm going, Bruce, like, I don't think I'm going to have to prospect ever again. Like, there's just so much freight to move that I don't think they'll ever get through this. And I think this is just going to be the rest of my career. Like, I not only like believed this, right? And this is like months of it. And like the numbers just never shrunk, and the amount of containers that need moved, like, it seemed like it was literally never ending. And I believed that, right? Well, fast forward 3 months, July, August of that year, that dried up to literally nothing. Like, literally no containers moved by the end of that summer.
So
all of it was gone.
Yeah, I've got I remember, so 2 things, because this is really good, and goes back to my point of like understanding what the market will do and the cycling of it. It's so important. So I remember, I don't know, it was like 2021, right? When everyone's making money. I was like, this is great. I was like, everything's gonna be good forever now. And then I'm like, no. You can't think like that. Like, there's always a cyclical part, and it did come. And I think it was literally yesterday, I was listening to like a talk radio show, and this guy calls in, and he's like asking for advice on his business. And he's like, yeah, all my expenses have gone up, and I'm not making as much money lately. And they're like, what kind of job are you working in? And he goes, oh, I'm a transportation broker for automobiles. He's an auto hauler, freight broker, right? So, and he's like, the cost of his leads went up. So like in the auto shipping business, you typically pay for your leads, right? Like, people will set up websites, hey, looking to ship your car, fill out this for a free quote. And they sell those leads to auto brokers. And they said the cost like tripled in the last like year. So instead of this guy adjusting his business, he just continued to do business the same way and pay more in his expenses to generate leads and ends up making less money, and he's in trouble. But the point of that is, like, if you see the market shifting, whether it's in federal interest rates going up or the whatever commodity you're shipping, if there's a change to it, you need to like forecast that. Like the other part I didn't mention with this guy is like auto shipping. It's less common when people have less is it called disposable income, right? You got less free money sitting around. Well, you're probably not shipping your car to Florida as a
Yes.
snowbird as much as when everyone's got buku extra money sitting around. So like that industry heavily relies on how the economy is doing. And if you're in that business, you should understand what's going to impact your specific market. The same thing would go with I'm trying to think like
Here's another one.
the
I'll
COVID.
give you.
Go ahead.
Jason Miller just posted this yesterday, and this is for the whole market. Right now, there's like a very high level of containers coming in through the West Coast. Like it's almost even comparable to kind of where COVID was, probably still a little lower, but like it's very high. However, we haven't seen that reflect into the spot market for truckload volumes. And Jason broke down this in a chart. You could see it on LinkedIn. He talked about the commodities, and he said, listen, like back then there was lots of consumer goods, to your point, lots of extra cash in the system. People weren't out, so they bought lots of things, even like toys, stuff for your house, computers. Lots of consumer goods were purchased, right? And that's what was primarily in those containers. Those types of goods typically don't sit at the ports long, and they don't sit in the warehouses by the ports very long. Their first leg of transit is almost directly into the United States on a van, because they're bringing them in and they ship them directly to warehouses into the middle of the country somewhere. And even shows the states and which percentage of those commodities go directly to these states, right? So there's a big correlation between those commodities and the van market and the number of loads to move. Right now, the containers are mostly full, a set of like solar related things, lots of solar sales,
Oh,
cells,
really?
and things related to that industry. And he said those types of things sit in warehouses near the ports much longer, do eventually get moved by trucks, but go to very different states, very different areas of the country, and very different volumes. And if you look at the percentages, it really looks pretty obvious how, even though we've got larger volumes of goods coming in through the ports, we don't see that same impact into the vans that you do for other types of commodities, right? And that's relying on like what's just happening in the United States, who's buying what, right? Like which things are we purchasing more of?
Yeah. So I think a lot of what we just talked about is related to understanding the market of freight brokerage at scale. Because I want to move on to the next part here, which is I'm going to talk about more of the sales and operations part of this. But um, if you're day one, or even if you're not even at day one, let's say you're just considering getting into brokerage, right? Or you're day one, or you're 5-10 years into the business. This is the stuff that's important no matter what, right? You need to understand at some level what impacts our industry, and how does it impact your customers, carriers, etc. And always just keep learning. I'm a big fan of like subscribe to every newsletter that's relevant to our industry. You don't have to read every single one of them, but at least have them conveniently delivered to your inbox each week. Right? We do two a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Sign up at our website, freight360.net. We get you market updates on rates. We get you commodity updates. We get you news updates, all that stuff, and some good educational training. All right. I wanted to move on to like the sales and operations side. I'm trying to think what I would if I could do something differently. Um, so I think this just depends on where you learn brokerage, whether it's a big box or a smaller company or who you learn from. I didn't realize how important carriers were at first. I always thought like and I feel like we talk about this a lot. Is it like, yeah, the customer is the one that pays the bill, but like you can't make the transaction happen without the carrier. And I think the importance of a carrier network, a strong carrier network, is really important. And this goes back to the market cycles, right? Like when the market is like when it's very, very loose and it's easy to get a truck, like, yeah, trucks are a dime a dozen. But when the market gets tight and it's hard to get a truck, that's when you really need your carriers.
Yep.
And the ones that you've screwed over in the past are going to remember that, and they're not going to want to haul for you when, when push comes to shove and you're in a pinch. But I think the importance of the carrier being just as important, to just as important as the customer is in the transaction, is something that it took me quite a while to grasp, and it probably correlated with like the market shifting. I remember looking at our carrier utilization in a report the one day, and it was like we didn't have a single carrier. It was like a year to date report. It might have been like a monthly report, and it was like the director was like, "This is bad," and I'm like, "What's bad?" He goes, "We don't have a single carrier that we've used like on more than 1% of our loads. Like that's a problem." Like
Yeah.
literally out of all of our loads, we're basically we're going through almost a new carrier on every single load because we don't have a carrier development program in place where we can easily identify. And it ended up leading to us building some tech around it where when you have a load in the system, it would, before you even look at load boards, the goal of the tech was like, let's look at who's hauled this before. I think they called it like the carrier smart source or search or something like that, where it would literally say, who did we run this for, or who ran this for us in the past, right? And how recently was it? And then it would also weigh in things like, where do we have what trucks do we have delivering near this pickup in our network right now? And then it would also weigh in like load board postings and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. But a capacity engine basically that was like, hey, let's not just post on DAT and Truck Stop and find the next available truck. Let's look at who's already in our network, who's literally delivering a load for us today that's going to be available to pick up tonight or tomorrow for this next load, or who did we use in the past? So that was, I think, for me, one of the things early on is because you think like, hey, customer pays a bill and the carrier, like, you know, we're there, we're the one paying them, right? So they should think of us as like the customer, right? But the reality is no, like it is one big partnership along the chain there. So long-winded, but yeah, the importance of the carrier was something that I didn't realize as early on, and which is ironic because I came from a
The
trucking
trucking side.
background. But in the trucking side, like we didn't use brokers. I worked for a big LTL carrier. Like we solicited business directly from shippers, and that was really where I learned freight sales was from an asset side direct. Like I would go sit down with a shipper in person. Um, but yeah, so the brokerage part of it very different, and
Yeah.
understanding too. Like I came from a large trucking side. I didn't understand the owner operator and the small fleet and how important they are, especially when you can't just call mega fleets all the time and get their trucks. You have to really, really build relationships with some of these smaller carriers.
Hold on one second. Pause that for 1 second.
All right, we're back. We're back from Ben's. We're gonna call it a bathroom break, even though that's not what it was. But
Um,
yeah, the importance of the carrier, man. That was my
correct.
whole, kind of eye-opening thing there.
One, it's huge, right? Like, because from a broker's perspective, like it's really obvious to your point about like when the market shifts. I mean, I could like because of all that stuff, right? That I was talking about earlier, like moving all those containers. I had a huge network of drayage carriers that I talked to every day that we trusted that I helped make a lot of money, right? Like everybody benefited, the carriers benefited, the shippers were able to work through this, right? So we ended up with really strong relationships, and also because I helped them work through issues and things. So for the rest of my time and career in brokerage, right? Like I could make a phone call and get a container moved almost anywhere in the country with somebody I knew, trusted, was familiar with the rate, knew their service. That made my life so much easier to cover freight, right? One, quoting, being able to get it done, the amount of time, but also like I could speak to that when I'm talking to a shipper. So, like the confidence I have when I'm talking about helping them with something it was true and it was there, right? Like it wasn't fake it till you make it. Like I could very much speak to the fact that like, oh, you need this done here. Yeah, I got 4 people there that I've worked with that I know can handle this. Here's the price range. Here's what time frame looks like, and I know we could do it. Oh, hey, you need to all motor this, or you got some really weird request. Did 6 of those last month with another customer. I've got the perfect drivers. We know that they'd be a fit for this. Here's where it's going to be. It's just so much faster, and the service is better, the trust is better, it works out better for the carriers. And to me, like that's the value again that we should be able to provide. Those are the things that like shippers want to be able to understand. Like, can you do this? Do you have people you trust, or are you just going to the boards to grab a random guy that's cheaper so that you can make an extra $75 on it? Like, they don't want that either, right? So
Mhm.
it makes your job faster. It makes you more efficient. It makes it more effective. It's better for the carriers. It's better for the customers. It's better for the brokers. Like paying attention to your carriers is probably as important as prospecting your shippers. Now they kind of come second because you can't really help or work with the carriers until you have the loads, but it doesn't make them any less important in my opinion. And I think that's one thing that like everybody could improve on and do more of, looking at the carriers that have run your loads in the past before you go to the market to go get another carrier. Look in your system. Did you move the load? Who moved it? How was the service? What did your notes look like? Reach out to them first. You already have some proven track record with them, so there's less risk and less risk of fraud. So huge point there.
Yeah.
The thing that I wanted to also segue into, which is like one of, I think, the most important lessons I learned as a broker, and I think absolutely has impacted all of the rest of my life as well. Like I had this huge issue when I started, and this was related to prospecting and moving freight, was paralysis by analysis, right? Which somebody, I'm sure most people are familiar with, like overthinking things. I thought that like I could find the perfect prospect through research, right? That had that right commodity at that right time so that I could minimize the amount of work or effort or discomfort in making cold calls. Nobody likes that. Like I was trying to literally kind of outthink the act of making lots of calls every day, right? I'm like, no, I know if I like research this enough, like find these perfect companies, like this will get this done, right? And my manager sat down with me, and I was probably like a month into just they called it the pit at the time. Basically, you go and sit with all of the new people. All you do is prospect. If you can't bring in customers under a certain time frame, like you don't make it to the floor. Like it's basically the proving ground or boot camp, if you will, of the logistics at these
Mhm.
companies. And he sat down next to me and he goes, Ben, like, because I was putting in a lot of hours. Like I'm showing up at 6:30, 6:15 when most people are showing up at 7:30. I'm not leaving till 6:30. Like I am going to make this work. So it wasn't that the effort wasn't there. It was where I was applying my effort, right? And I wasn't making, and I was still probably making 100 calls or 80 calls, but I spent so much time trying to research them before and after work. And my boss got in early every day. So he would be the only one there seeing me doing this every morning. And he sat with me the one day and he goes, Ben, like, I really think you are overthinking this. And I go, I remember saying this. I was like, that's silly. How can I overthink it? How is more information going to make this harder for me? Like, that's ridiculous, right? Like, I had this like overconfidence in this approach to it. And I remember how he said it to me because he goes, Ben, do you trust me? And he like looked me square in the face, like very seriously, right? And I'm like, okay, like, yeah, I do. I mean, like, I took the job with you. I believe that what you're telling me is going to get me where I want to go. He'd been there like 16 years at the time. And I'm like, yeah. And I also trusted him as a friend and a person. So, like, I was like, yeah, I do trust you. He goes, will you follow my directions? And I think it was for like a month. He goes, can you do this for a month? And I go, I could do anything for a month. It's a reasonable time frame. What do I need to do? Right. He goes, I want you to just pick a direction, any direction. He's like, in fact, I'll let you pick two. I think it was like 2 or 3 different commodities. He goes, I only want you to pick 2 or 3. But the only thing I want you to focus on is just making the calls. Don't think about what's going on. Don't necessarily try to find the perfect lead. Just move and
Repetition. Yeah.
keep moving in that direction. He
Yep.
goes, if you do this, you will make it. And I'm like, okay, like I'll trust you. I'm like, what do I have to lose at this point? And I remember the time frame because it took me about 6 weeks of doing this. And it ended up, I looked up the numbers the one time. I think it was something like around 2,000 calls or 2,200 calls I made in those 6 weeks, right? And sure as shit, I found the needle in the haystack was the one company, right, that had a ton of freight, that had good margins and what they needed to move because of what the type of the commodities were, and they needed help like desperately. There was one logistics person at this company, and he was like had access to like 70 loads a day and was only able to move like 25 of them because he just couldn't move them fast enough. And he's like, yeah, I have access to all this freight and like I just can't move them quick enough. And I was like, oh, I went at it as like the co-brokerage. I'm like, well, we can definitely put an agreement in place where we could help you move the loads you're not getting to. We can split the margins. Your customer ends up getting more freight moved. You benefit by looking better to them, and we all work together, right? Took like 2 or 3 weeks to get us onboarded, but once we did, like I literally went from like moving a couple loads a week here and there to I was hitting like 10K a week in gross profit inside of like 3 months out of like proving ground. Like I jumped from maybe not having a job to being like top 10 in the office out of like 150 people, just following the simple direction of do more, think less, right?
Yep.
Just keep doing this, and the practice and the repetition gets you better at the conversations, the objections, and hearing and listening for the opportunities and the conversations that you're actually having.
Yeah, I kind of I want to piggyback on that, and the other because I thought about this earlier, and this was never really me, but I've just experienced it with other people around me. Is the importance of that repetition because your book of business isn't going to last forever, and it's
Correct. It's
in
all
its current
finite.
state, right? Like I've seen too many times where someone in my company or someone that I know has that one mammoth customer and they're just like banking their retirement on it and they lose it. Like there's a dude I know now that it hasn't happened luckily and he's been able to diversify his book, but like numerous times I was like, yeah, you might be doing 10 million a year with this customer, but what happens when, when you're not and you got this whole team that you've hired in this office space and your Maserati or whatever you're driving. But I have actually seen people that have lost. Like I just saw
Yeah.
a dude that like bought a new house, new truck,
A boat, dirt
not a
bikes.
boat, probably a
Yeah.
boat, but I don't think a boat. And then like you lose a customer, and it's like man, like, and it was the only one. So yeah, the paralysis analysis, people, it kind of relates. Like you got the one customer and you're like, oh, I'm going to wait for the right, referral to come from this customer. Like, no, you got to always be prospecting, always be calling,
Correct.
making new introductions and
Well,
connections.
to
So
that point, right? That customer, the reason we stopped doing business with them, and like I am still friends. Actually, that guy passed away, but like I literally am still friends with his son on Facebook, and this is like a decade later, right? But why we stopped doing business was nothing happened that was wrong. They were making a lot more money with working with us because we were helping them move more freight and they were benefiting from it. But why we stopped working together was because the company was getting acquired and eventually did. It got bought by a bigger company and they wanted to pare down the number of volumes and loads they were moving for valuations and things and how they were being moved. And they moved more of it to their assets. And anyway, at the end of the day, like it was literally no fault of any of ours. It's just something that happens. Companies get bought all the time. They change their departments. They hire different people. They get, merged with another company. And again, everything is temporary. Like even if you
yeah,
like the other thing I think that is the example of this, it's really evident. It's like if you look Google like the stats of like how many companies in the Fortune 500 were there like 10 years ago. Like even the largest companies, the literally Fortune 500 or the S&P, right? Like those companies turn over all of the time. It's not like when we grew up in the 70s and or even the 80s, right, where companies existed like GE and things that were around for 100 years. Like companies are constantly being acquired, going out of business, being merged. Things change so much faster now. Like it is certainly true in our industry.
yeah. Because I've heard you mention the Fortune 500 a few times. Like here, and I pulled up some stats here. Um, the like 1970s, the entire Fortune 500 turned over within that decade. The entire, like, not a
The
single
whole
one of
thing.
them was on it from the beginning to the end. And you've got like um annual turnover now. No, this is this is going back 10 years, about 14, 15 per year are turning over. A third of the Fortune 500 can turn over in 5 years on average. Like this stuff happens. And again, it's not companies going out of business.
Yeah.
They get bought by somebody else, right? That's what you have to think about is stuff like that. But yeah.
Here's the last one too. And I want to kind of wrap with this one because this is the other one that I think is incredibly beneficial in other aspects of life, but for sure in freight. The same paralysis by analysis I was applying to moving freight, meaning like I was trying to predict everything that could go wrong, somehow plan for it. And I was spending so many hours before work and after work just overthinking how to prevent any issue from occurring. And same manager, same mentor sat down with me and he goes, hey, remember when we were talking about you prospecting and, overthinking things? He's like, I think you're doing that moving freight too. And I went, well, what do you mean? Like, how is it not beneficial to try to figure out what's going to happen and try to prevent it before it does? Like, isn't that like just good planning and just, I don't know, good business sense or common sense? And he said, and I remember how he even phrased it. He goes, Ben, like the thing about our industry is something is going to go wrong all of the time, like at least once a week, sometimes once a day, sometimes many times in a day. You're never going to be able to predict what's going to go wrong in the future. He's like, if you want to survive in this industry, you're going to drive yourself nuts trying to guess what will happen. He's like, if you want to have a career doing this, you need to develop the confidence in your ability to solve whatever comes up, not to predict what comes up, right? Yeah. And that is one of those lessons that is applied in everything I do, is that like, I don't really worry about the market anymore. I mean, I'm aware and I read about it, but I don't worry about it because I can't do anything about it. I don't worry about what happens with any of my businesses anymore because I'm like, I know shit's going to change. The only thing I know that is going to be true next year is it isn't going to look like this year, that the beginning of next year won't look like the fall this year in freight and shipping and coaching and any of our businesses, right? So like, I don't worry about it anymore because at this point, things have changed so many times and have scared me and I thought weren't going to work out. But at the end of the day, like you just adapt. And if you are focused and have a keen interest in the outcome and you're patient, you find different ways to do it and you'll succeed in whatever it looks like. So for me, like whether it's moving a load and trying to predict what could or couldn't happen, or just starting a new venture or anything in life. Like I spend almost none of my life worrying about the uncertainty of the future anymore. And I really just try to work on improving myself and my own abilities to solve whatever the hell is going to come up. Right.
Yep. No, that's good, man. That's good. It's like the old phrase, don't worry about what you can't control basically you can only control the controllables, right? And a lot of that is your reaction to certain things.
And the other one is like man plans and God laughs, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. Well, hey man, good episode. Hopefully by the time this comes out Friday, our folks and fans and listeners down in Florida are doing all right. So we're thinking about you guys. Final thoughts.
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills. That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.